All right, Candyland, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you for joining us today on Wednesday, August 26th, 2020. Today is Women's Equality Day. Today we are going to learn about women's suffrage and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Before I introduce you to our guest speaker, let's start with the Girl Scout promise and law. Please raise your right hand and join me. On my honor, I will try to serve God and my country, to help people at all times, and to live by the Girl Scout law. I will do my best to be honest and fair, friendly and helpful, considerate and caring, courageous and strong, and responsible for what I say and do, and to respect myself and others, respect authorities, use resources wisely, make the world a better place, and be a sister to every Girl Scout. Miss Ann Donegan is an historian at Santa Rosa Junior College and the chair of the Social Sciences Department. She has been teaching U.S., European, U.S. women's and race, ethnicity, and gender history courses at Santa Rosa Junior College since 1995. And Ann earned her B.A. from Colgate University with a major in European history and a minor in religious studies. She soon moved to California, where she earned her M.A. at San Francisco State University with a major in U.S. history and a minor in women's history. Along with Santa Rosa Junior College, Ann has taught at City College of San Francisco, Chadbot College, and Vista College, now Berkeley City College. Thank you, Ms. Donegan, for joining us.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Ann, as my great introducer, is that a word? Person who introduced me, said, I'm here in Northern California, north of San Francisco. I love seeing where you're all from. That is so cool that people from all over the country. For my fellow Northern Californians, I hope everyone's safe. We're dealing with fires, and listen to our great firefighters and authorities to stay safe. People on the Gulf Coast, thinking about you guys, stay safe with the hurricane, lots of crazy weather out there, but at least let's try to, sometimes it's nice to focus on something else than our immediate surroundings, and let's take the next hour or so to learn about the 19th Amendment. What a great week to talk about the 19th Amendment, because it was 100 years ago this week that first the state of Tennessee, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the state of Tennessee was the last state needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that said it's illegal to prevent anyone from voting on the basis of sex. And then a day or two later, I think it was actually, today's the day, Congress then recognized Tennessee's move, and it was added to the Constitution, right? And again, the Constitution, because I know that's a word you probably hear people throw around, the Constitution is the most powerful form of law in the United States, right? And it blankets the entire country. There's federal law made in Washington, D.C. There's state law made in Sacramento if you're in California, or Boston if you're in Massachusetts, or Albany if you're in New York, right? There's your local town or county law, but the Constitution is the most powerful form of law. So having this added to the Constitution is a big deal. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully the technology works for me.
Yay, it worked.
Yay! Thank you for that positive affirmation. Okay, so before I jump right in, as I've said and Landon said, I am a historian, right? And so what do historians do? We look at why things happened. What were the causes that led to things happening, right? So the 19th Amendment, right, said you can't legally ban women from voting anymore, right? So what I want to look at over the next hour is, why was that the case? What did women and men do to force the government to allow women the vote? Why was it that only in reality that only white women could vote because of the 19th Amendment? And then also, why did it take so long? Right? Our country was founded in 1783, yet women can't vote until 1920. That's a long time for women not being able to vote, and longer for women of color, as we'll see, right? Okay, so here's my opening slide. And that picture that I put here is the front cover of the official program for a huge women's suffrage parade, about 10,000 women and men. There were definitely some men there, lots of kids, 10,000 or so folks who marched from the US Capitol. You can see the picture of the Capitol here in the background. They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. And if you've been to Washington, D.C., you know that's like one of the main big streets in our nation's capital, from the Capitol down to the White House, about 2 miles, right? And we're going to be talking about this parade at a few junctures in this lecture today. So I wanted to start off with this program cover, right? Okay, so I said I was a historian. I like to know how things got started. So even though we're going to get to 1920, which is when the 19th Amendment was added, but I want to start actually a bit further back than that, when our country was founded in 1783. I bet most of you have had some US history so far in school. And you know that at one point, what we call the United States today, especially if you're on the East Coast where you guys are, right, from Maine, even though Maine was still part of Massachusetts at this time, but from Maine down to Georgia, you guys know those were the original 13 colonies, right? Well, at one point, many men and women in those colonies said, we don't want to be part of England anymore. We want to break up with you, England, and create our new country, right? And if you've learned about US history, you've probably heard this phrase before, or maybe like in a car commercial around July 4th. Have you heard this phrase? No taxation without representation, right? That was one of the slogans of the men and women who wanted to break away from England. And I want you to say that slowly in your head, right? No, because often we say that kind of fast without thinking about it. No taxation without representation, right? If you're going to tax me, government, I want a representative. I want to vote for someone who can be there in the room when these decisions are happening, right? So that was one of the key reasons for why the colonies wanted to break away from England, because they wanted the right to vote. So that's core at the founding of our country. And what else is at the core at the founding of our country? Well, in 1776, we write this document called the Declaration of Independence. I bet you guys have heard of this one before. Some pretty famous lines from this document, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I bet you guys have heard of that one too, or those as well, right? So those are our founding ideals, right? Equality, liberty, right? We wanted voting. Well, we go to war with England. Shockingly, we win. Take a history class on that. It's a really interesting story. Shockingly, we win, right? And now the rubber hits the road, right? We're now creating this brand new baby country.
Write down this.
Sorry? Oh, sorry. You guys can, if you could mute, that'd be great. I will stop for questions soon, I promise, right? So now we have to create this, we've created this brand new country called the United States of America. If we said voting was one of our ideals, who can vote? Well, I'll tell you who can vote when our country was founded. White men who owned enough property. right? Because one of the myths, lies, and biases that are there when our country is founded is that men by their nature, made by God, whatever you want to say, right? That men by their nature, right, are smarter and more moral than women. And that's why they wanted men to be in positions of leadership and decision-making, right? Why it was okay for women not to vote. Who else were seen as less smart and less moral? Well, definitely poor men, right? Only men with property could vote. The idea was if you were smart, poor men, you would own enough property, right? So we're not going to let you vote. Similarly, we said the same things about Native Americans, and we said the same things about African Americans, right? So when our country was founded, even though we have these great ideals, life, liberty, pursuing happiness, equality, voting, in reality, those ideals were just upheld for white men with enough property, right? And when the country is founded, right, even though one of the first lines here in that Declaration of Independence is all men are created equal, slavery is legal, right? The owning of African-American human beings, right, was legal in the United States throughout the entire country. So obviously that's a big contradiction that we're gonna see play out in US history, right? My next point here, I just want to point out, in the state of New Jersey, and I bet there's some people from New Jersey on this Zoom call, the state of New Jersey was a bit radical there in the day. When the country was founded in 1783, the state of New Jersey said, white women, if you're single, so if you're not married, if you're rich enough, you could vote in New Jersey, because the idea was if I'm a wealthy white woman in New Jersey, I'm being taxed, so I should have representation. But New Jersey got rid of that in 1803. But for the first 20 years of our country's existence, New Jersey women who were white and rich enough could vote. All right, let me go through one more slide and then I'll maybe stop for questions with this early part of the program. Okay, look at the date now, 1848. So this is ballpark, what, like 70 years after the country's founded? 60, 70 years after the country's founded? We're now in upstate New York. You East Coast people know where upstate New York is, right? Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, all those areas up there. In the town of Seneca Falls, right, we see a women's rights convention. Not the first one in the world. The French had a few ahead of us, but this is the first one here in the United States, right? In upstate New York, again, take a history course because this stuff is so interesting. Upstate New York was an area along the Erie Canal. Again, you New York people have heard of the Erie Canal, right? Along the Erie Canal was a really radical, progressive place before the Civil War. A lot of anti-slavery people, people who wanted to outlaw alcohol. They saw alcohol as a sin, wanted to remove it from society, and also the beginnings of the women's rights movement. Right. So we have this convention, and there were about 300 people in attendance. People that you may have heard of, right, who were there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They were the two leaders at Seneca Falls. But there was also this gentleman here in the center. These are statues at the National Historical Center in Seneca Falls. It's a great place if you're up in that area. In their museum there. This is Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery and ran away and became a huge figure in the anti-slavery movement. He was there. William Lloyd Garrison were there. Angelina and Sarah Grimke. If you've studied abolition, there were a lot of people who were anti-slavery there. Well, at this conference, which was, I think, a long weekend, 3-day conference, it was overwhelmingly Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? She was the author of a document that came out of this conference, right? What this conference called for or stood for. And this document is titled the Declaration of Sentiments. And what Stanton did was she pretty much took the Declaration of Independence, what you just saw on the previous side, and she copied it. She wasn't cheating, right? If you were one of my students, I would say that's cheating. You can't do that, right? But she was making a point. She was making the point that this great document with all those ideals that I talked about in the previous slide are great for men, but we want them too, right? So in this document, the Declaration of Sentiments, she includes the language, right? That amongst these, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that amongst these say that all men and women are created equal, right? So about 70 years after the Declaration of Independence is written, Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848 adds the word women. Now, to be fair, in 1848, most people, women and men, thought this was a crazy idea because we still didn't think women, by this time, again, take a US history class, by this time women are considered the nicer ones, but we're still not considered very smart. So the idea of women involved in politics seemed crazy, but now it's written down. Because in this document, the Declaration of Sentiments, it says things like women should have access to colleges and universities. Women weren't allowed to go to college at this time. Women should have access to any of the professions. Well, this was a pretty religious time in our country. Women weren't allowed to be ministers in most churches and temples, right? Women couldn't go to college. I already said that, couldn't go to college. Women couldn't vote. The divorce laws were different. It was much easier for me to divorce my wife if I was a man than for me to divorce my husband, right? So they were calling for all of these things in this document, right? Okay. Well, this is a short slide, so maybe I'll go through this slide and then I'll stop. Okay. So 13 years after the Declaration of Sentiments, the Civil War starts. And you guys have probably heard of the Civil War, right? And it will start in 1861. And I want to show you this map just for a second here. As I said, when the country was founded in 1783, all of our original 13 colonies, again, by this time, Maine has broken up with Massachusetts, but from here down to Georgia, all of those states said slavery was legal. But from 1783 up until about the 1830s, all of these states on the northern part of the East Coast, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those states, the ones in blue there, all said, well, you know, we say we have those ideals in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, being able to be happy. Those don't fit with slavery. How can we say that those are what we're supposed to be about in the United States of America, and yet we have slavery? So all of those states have outlawed slavery by this time. Also, all these other blue states have outlawed slavery, right? California, Oregon. But these gray states, right, from Virginia down to Texas, slavery is still legal there. Okay. Well, in 1860, right, you've probably heard of this guy named Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, right, was nominated by the Republican Party. It's the same Republican Party of today, at least in name, right? The Republican Party at this time was a brand new baby political party. It was just created, right? And so Abraham Lincoln was a no-name in 1860. He was a new congressman, very, very ambitious, as most presidents are, but he was a no-name. No one knew him, right? But he ran for president with this new party called the Republican Party. And the only thing that the Republican Party, again, not true today, but in 1860, the only thing that the Republican Party said, hey, you guys should vote for me, I'm a Republican, is because they said, out here in these Western territories, you see how they don't have state lines yet? Because in 1860, all of these areas were just known as territories. There weren't enough US citizens for them to qualify for statehood, right? So the Republican Party said, Abraham Lincoln said, if you vote for me, I won't let slavery expand out here, right? I have no opinion about slavery in Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, et cetera, et cetera. I have no opinion about that. But out here in what will become Nevada and Utah and Montana and the Dakotas, et cetera, I'm not going to let slavery get there. Well, who didn't like that? People who own slaves, white people who own slaves in the South, because they said, I have the right to bring my property. The law says my slave is my property. I have the right to bring my property wherever I want, right? And so just the election of Abraham, I mean, the poor man hadn't even gotten the White House yet, right? He was elected in November. He wasn't going to get into the White House until March. But between November of 1860, excuse me, and March of 1861, South Carolina was first, but then all these other gray states, these 11 states said, we're out of here. I want nothing to do with the United States. It's not my president. It's not my flag. It's not my constitution. Those aren't my laws. We're going to create our own separate country, right? And then that will start the Civil War, right, in 1861. Okay, so I think I will, if you guys have any questions, it's a good place for me to fill up my water glass.
Wonderful. So we do have a few questions.
Okay.
The first question was, and I'm sure you'll get to it, but what was the exact date of the first election where women could vote after the 19th Amendment was passed?
So I guess if it was in August, the first presidential election would have been 12, 16. It would have been 1924, but it would have been 1924 for all women, supposedly, but again, remember, women of color weren't allowed. But here's the kind of complicated or interesting thing. There were states that allowed women to vote before the 19th Amendment, right? Where I'm living now in California, women were voting since 1910. Right, so there were different states that allowed women to vote before 1920, but again, remember the Constitution blankets the entire country. So it would have been a 1924 presidential election.
Perfect. And then the next question was, who were the first women that are noted in history who spoke up and started saying, look, it's not fair that women can't vote and men can? Are those people documented in history?
Well, like I said, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was definitely one of them. Lucretia Mott, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, all of those people before the Civil War are really loud callers for women to have equal rights, for African American and European American men and women to have equal rights. And they, that's a good, I'm assuming that Frederick Douglass would have supported Native American rights too, but I don't know that off the top of my head. But if you study colonial history and early American history, Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, the second president of the United States, one of her famous letters to him, she says, as he's helping write the Declaration of Independence, right? Thomas Jefferson gets all the hype, but John Adams had a lot to say in that document. There's a famous line where she says to her husband, remember the ladies, as you're creating this new government, don't let husbands be as tyrants as they are now. Now, there are many people say, look, Abigail Adams wanted women to vote. The evidence doesn't seem to suggest this. What she is probably challenging is that in this country, in some cases up until the 1980s, which isn't that far away, long ago, many married women, not single women, which is why single women in New Jersey could vote, were covered by something called coverture. Can you hear the word there, cover? Meaning once I get married, I'm covered by my husband. And a lot of married women couldn't do things like testify in a court of law, definitely vote, sign a will, sign a contract. My husband could do those things for me, but I couldn't. So what most historians believe is that Abigail Adams was talking about getting rid of coverture, where husbands had that control over women. So she was one. Sojourner Truth was an African-American enslaved woman who a brilliant poet. You guys should Google her. Her poetry is amazing. Only African-American woman published in the colonial period in North America. She definitely pointed out the hypocrisy of a country founded on liberty, and she was a slave. Her writing is brilliant. So there were lots of them, but those are just some of them.
Thank you. And then the last question before I'll let you get back to your presentation is, when did slavery start in the United States specifically?
Yeah. Good question. The beginnings of race-based slavery, which means a law saying people from Africa must be slaves for life. I hate to say it because it was started in my home state of Massachusetts in 1641, right? So Massachusetts was founded in 1630. The colony of Massachusetts was founded in 1630, right? That's a long time ago, right? Well, for the first 11 years, there were Africans in Massachusetts, just like in all the other colonies, who were free people, right? That's an important point. There were always free Africans and African Americans here, right? But in 1641, the colony of Massachusetts will say any African who comes into the colony from this point forward must be a slave for life, right? Now, Massachusetts didn't really have that many enslaved people, right? But it's the first, when a colony does it once, it's easier for all the other colonies to follow, right? And so Virginia will be the real kind of trailblazer, if that's the right word, leader in making laws about slavery. And so Virginia will have their law, any African who enters Virginia from here on out must be a slave for life, starting in 1661. So it goes back a good 400 or 350 years.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good questions, guys. Keep them coming. Okay, so back to this map, right? So those 11 states, right, say, we want nothing to do with you, United States. We hate this guy, Lincoln. We want nothing to do with, so they break away and form their own country. You've probably heard of this before, the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. Oftentimes we refer to it as the South. Well, the war, this was a long, ugly war, 4 years of war, right? And in 1865, the United States wins, right? The United States wins primarily because those blue states, way bigger population and way more factories. And this was our first industrial war. If you're gonna fight a war, you want factories, because factories make guns and bullets and trains, so you can move soldiers and supplies on train rather than by horseback, right? It had such a huge technological advantage. But so in 1865, the war ends, right? Lincoln is still president for about a month before he gets killed, right? And this will now usher us into, with the end of the war ends, the United States wins. These 11 states are forced back into the United States, kicking and screaming. They did not want to come back. They created their own country, right? They didn't want to come back, but they come back in kicking and screaming. And then we enter into the period after the Civil War called Reconstruction. Can you hear that word, reconstruct? That means we're rebuilding the country after this horrible war. And Reconstruction will last from 1865, right? That's the year the war ended, up until 1877. And during Reconstruction, we see three, in my opinion, incredible things added to the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution is the most powerful form of law in the United States, right? So the same year that the war ends, we're going to add the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment says it's illegal to own people in the United States. the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. So I'm going to link it back to one of those good questions 3 or 4 minutes ago. Slavery was legal in what became the United States from 1641 in Massachusetts up until 1865, right? So 224 years, right? A few years after the 13th Amendment is added, we add the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And this one's a big one too, right? The 14th Amendment says that all of us are guaranteed equal protection under the law. So whenever a law is passed, your local town council, right, your town government, your state government, or the federal government, the law has to treat everybody the same. So you can't have a law for people who wear glasses that doesn't apply to people who don't wear glasses, right? The law has to treat everybody the same, right? And the other part of the 14th Amendment, which is also, a big one, the 14th Amendment says that regardless of who your parents are, regardless of who your mom or dad is, if you're born in the United States, you're a US citizen, right? That's a big one. Because what some southern states were trying to do after Reconstruction was say that African Americans weren't citizens of the United States because they were born as slaves. They might be free now, but since they were born as slaves, they weren't real citizens. And the 14th Amendment says, no, you can't do that. If you were born here, you're automatically a citizen of the United States, right? Okay, well, as you could imagine, there were quite a few white Southerners at the time who weren't happy with the 13th or 14th Amendment, right? They didn't like these changes. They were taught by their parents, their church, their government, that slavery was the right thing, right? They said, God said it was okay, right? So in many cases, the reason why many white Southerners went along with the 13th and 14th, because they didn't want it, was because there were US troops occupying the South, right? We see this in wars all the time. When two countries go to war, in this case, two regions of the same country go to war, the winners often occupy the losers' land. So the winners can tell the losers of a war what to do, right? So there were US troops in those 11 gray states, I'm not going to go back to that map, kind of making sure that white people, as much as they could, went along with the 13th and the 14th Amendment, right? Because, like I said, there were a lot of white people who weren't happy about these things at this time. So in light of that, those troops were there, but everyone knew at a certain point, we're going to want those troops to come home, right? A lot of you guys are quite a bit younger than me, but if you're, old enough, you'll remember that we had this discussion in our country over the last 10 or 15 years about when are our troops in Afghanistan coming home? When are our troops in Iraq coming home? Because at one time you want your dad, your husband, your son, now your mom, wife, and sister, right, daughter to come home, right? So they knew that at one point the troops are going to be pulled home. How are those African Americans going to have a fighting chance in the South? Because while there are so many African Americans in the South, right, at this time, there were still more white people, more European Americans, right? So people started to come up with this idea of, oh God, how can we make sure that things like the 13th and 14th Amendment are going to be followed once the troops go home? So then we threw out there a really radical idea. And again, I should be careful because I know that word radical today has really been transformed in society. I'm using a classic political definition of radical. A radical is someone who wants change right now, right? A liberal is someone who wants social change, but we're okay with it being kind of slow. A radical is someone who says, that's unfair, that's wrong, change it right now, right? So for example, before the Civil War, all those anti-slavery people were radical. They wanted to end slavery yesterday, right? Okay. Well, so we get the troops there, but they're probably going to want to go home soon. So we started to float this idea. What about if we add an amendment to the Constitution letting Black people vote? Because if we let Black people vote, they'll vote for politicians who will do whatever they can to protect the 13th and the 14th Amendment. It's a fighting chance. And one of the biggest voices for what will become the 15th Amendment about Black suffrage will be Frederick Douglass, the guy who I showed you the statue of up at Seneca Falls, right? Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved person himself. And then there was a senator from the state of Massachusetts, a guy by the name of Charles Sumner, who was a huge abolitionist and a very strong supporter of all these amendments, right? So here was the problem. That, not a surprise, African Americans everywhere in the North and the South thought this was a great idea. Of course, we should be allowed to vote. Remember what our country's founded on. And it shouldn't be a surprise, most white Southerners didn't really like that idea. But here was the problem with white people in the North. By this time, and we're talking 1870 now, as the slide shows you, by this time, most white Northerners were good with ending slavery. Unfortunately, that wasn't true through much of the Civil War. Much of the Civil War, most white people in the North thought slavery was okay. Even though they abolished it, they said, well, if that's what they want in the South, who cares, right? But by this time, 5 years after the war, we said, oh yeah, we did good, white Northerners, by getting rid of slavery. But I might be anti-slavery by 1870 if I'm a white person living in Michigan or Vermont or California, right? But that doesn't mean I'm okay with Black people voting, right? I can still be racist, but be against slavery. Because remember what I said about when the country was founded, there were still those myths, lies, and biases that we had as white people against African Americans. We just didn't think they were smart enough or trustworthy enough, moral enough to vote. So it made us kind of nervous about people voting. Well, let me clarify something because I wasn't absolutely clear on purpose. When Frederick Douglass and Charles Sumner brought up the 15th Amendment, they were only talking about African American men, not African American women. And even though those two men personally thought women should vote, all adults should vote. It's the United States of America, adults should vote. Remember, no taxation without representation. That was one of our founding ideals. But both Douglass and Charles Sumner knew, and I'm going to go back to this map here, knew that if we're going to add this amendment to the Constitution, we have to get support from Northern voters, right? We know the South isn't going to support it, right? But we have to get support, enough support in the North. And here was the reality, that in 1870, for white Northerners, white men Northerners, because they were the voters, right? White men. By this time, we got rid of that property requirement, so all white men could vote in the country by 1870. The reality was that white men in the North were more scared of women voting than Black men voting. It seemed less threatening to them. And so here would have been a scenario. Let's say I'm a banker in Philadelphia, right? In Eastern Pennsylvania. I'm a white man banker, and I'm a proud Republican. Remember, Lincoln was a Republican. It's the Republican Party that supported the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. Or we're not, well, we're close to the 15th Amendments, right? So I'm a proud Republican. And yes, I'm so proud that we ended slavery. That was good of us to do. I'm proud Republican Party member, et cetera, et cetera. But now they're talking about letting Black men vote. Well, I don't know. Are they that smart? Blah, 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 right? I've been sucking in those myths, lies, and biases my whole life. But I say to myself, well, I'm here in Philadelphia. Now, I'm not talking about Philadelphia in 2020. I'm talking about Philadelphia in 1870. There aren't that many African-American people in Philadelphia at that time. We don't see a huge number of African-Americans move from the South up to, there were always African-Americans in the North, always. But we don't see substantial populations move from the South to the North until after World War I, right? After, in the 1920s, late teens, 1920s. And when do they come out here in the West where I am? World War II, right, in 1940s. So I'm in Philadelphia in 1870. There's not that many Black people here. So if they let Black men vote, and maybe they're right, maybe they're not right to be voters, maybe they're not smart enough, they're not good enough, remember those myth, lies, and biases, it's not really going to affect me in Pennsylvania because there aren't that many Black people here. That'll be Georgia's problem, that'll be Florida's problem, that'll be Alabama's problem, not mine in Pennsylvania. So I'm good with Black men voting. But if you expand the 15th to include women, African American women, and European American women, let me tell you, Philadelphia is crawling with women. They're everywhere, right? I'm married to one of them, right? And remember coverture laws. I might kind of like being married to someone who can't open up her own bank account. I might like being married to someone who it's harder for her to divorce me than for me to divorce her. I don't necessarily want her to enter into contracts without me knowing about it, right? That seemed like more of a threat to me. And at this time, right, a married woman couldn't testify in a court of law. So let's say, again, I'm back being that banker in Philadelphia. I'm not proud. I mean, I love my wife. I'm not proud of this, but what if I came home one day and it was a really tough day at work and our kids did something screwy at school today and my wife was telling me about it and I'm not proud about it, but what if I hit her? She couldn't go to the police, right? Or she could, but they can't take her testimony because of coverture. So what Frederick Douglass and Charles Sumner, again, even though these two men personally thought, of course, women should vote, but they said, if we link women to the 15th Amendment, it will die in a New York minute because it was too threatening to white men in the North, right? It was seen as too much of a threat. So the 15th Amendment went forward, let me go back to this, in 1870 by saying you can't prevent anyone from voting on the basis of race. So since all white men could vote, now all Black men can vote, which is still pretty remarkable, right? Remember 5 years ago, African Americans were enslaved. Not all, but definitely most, right? Now I've got a job, my husband got a job, my kids are in school and my husband can vote. God bless America, right? If anybody understood the American dream in this country, it's Black people during Reconstruction because the government really went to bat for them, right? At least for Reconstruction. Not so much after, but at least for Reconstruction, right? Well, not only did Black men were able to vote in 1870, man, did they vote. They voted in huge numbers, right? And they ran for office. They became mayors and state representatives and sat on town councils and they became congressmen. In fact, we had, my husband and I were just talking about this the other day, 2 senators, 2 Black senators and 1 Black governor during Reconstruction. I mean, it was a credible change. Really, that's radical change. Quick social change, right? Well, let me go back to being a white person in the South. I already talked about my concerns about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. Man, to many white people in the South, the 15th Amendment was a kick in the teeth because now I have Black men in positions of power over me, Black men who are passing laws that affect me, right? That goes against everything I was raised. So we start to see quite a bit of backlash, right? Groups like the KKK, the White League really start targeting Black voters, Black politicians, and their white allies, right? There's a lot of ugly violence during this time, right? To the point where, right, I put at the top here, Reconstruction ends in 1877, because by this time the federal government doesn't have the stomach for paying for and supporting Reconstruction anymore. And in 1877, all those troops are removed. And it's horrible, because then there's some really horrible amounts of violence targeting Black Southerners and their white allies, basically saying, you know, this long national nightmare of the Civil War and Reconstruction are over, and now we're back in charge. And so what many of us as white people in the South really want to focus on is reinstating segregation, right? Where white people are the decision makers and Black people do what they're told, right? And one of the ways we really want to reinstitute that is by taking away those voting rights that Black men got with in 1870, right? There are a couple ways that this was done. One was a poll tax, P-O-L-L, poll tax. So when you go to a poll, right, when you go to your polling place, you gotta pay. And generally speaking, white people had a little bit more money in their pocket than Black people. So that was a really effective way of getting Black people from voting, right? There were other things like literacy tests. If you're gonna vote, you have to prove that you can read and write, because we don't want any dumb voters. So if I was a white man that went in to try to register to vote, I had to sign my name. Most people could sign their name. That was good. But if I was a Black man, I might have to go in and be handed, here's the state constitution of Alabama. Read sections 4.2 to 6.8, and then explain it in your own words. So the standards of being literate were different for Black voters and white voters. So that got rid of a lot of Black voters, Black men voters. And then the last one, which was really the most effective, was something called the grandfather clause. And this was and these were state laws. The poll tax, the literacy test, all occurred overwhelmingly in those southern states. Same with the grandfather clause. And what the grandfather clause said was this: if your grandfather could vote, you can vote. Well, we see these laws being passed in the 1880s, 1890s, after the troops are pulled out, in the early 1900s. So if a Black man in 1890, my grandfather was probably a slave, and slaves couldn't vote. So not only did this take away my right to vote, but it took away my grandchildren's right to vote, and so on, and so on, and so on. So this was a really effective way. Of course, I'm not talking about morals here. I'm talking about political effectiveness, efficacy, I guess that's the right word, of removing the vote from Black men, because if you can't vote, you lose your power, and you're a lot easier to control. And that was a way of reinstating segregation after Reconstruction. I know these are really heavy, difficult topics, and I'll stop for questions in a second. And we won't see that this will be well, and I should say this, right? There will still be some Black men who will still be able to get around the poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, but it's a really tiny minority. Most Black men will not be legally allowed to vote by about 1910 because of these laws. And unfortunately, when the 19th Amendment goes into effect in 1920, the Constitution doesn't say white women only, but because of these state laws, Black women will be caught by the same things, right? But we'll talk about that when we get to the 19th Amendment. We are almost there to the 19th Amendment. I was gonna say one more thing about that, wasn't I? I'm sure it'll come back to me. Let me go back to the 15th Amendment, right? So like I said, Douglas and Sumner personally, of course, women should vote, all adults should vote. But the 15th Amendment, for those reasons I said, went ahead just for Black men. Well, there were a number of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton at Seneca Falls. And you've probably heard of Susan B. Anthony. She now became she wasn't at Seneca Falls. She was a little bit too young for that, but she's now very active. She was an active anti-slavery person, now an active women's rights person. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were very much opposed to the 15th Amendment because they said it was unfair. I'm not going to support some group voting, even though they deserve the right to vote, but I'm not going to support it unless everyone can vote, right? And they formed a group called the NWSA. You see it there on the slide, the National Women's Suffrage Association. I know it's a mouthful, right? But then there were some feminists who said, no, that's okay. You know, I'm more of a liberal than a radical. I'm okay with baby step changes. We're going in the right direction. We support the 15th Amendment. And that was the American Women's Suffrage Association. And I know I keep on using this word suffrage, right? That's a weird word. So I don't know why we do, but we use Latin a lot when we talk about legal things. Suffrage means law. Wrong. Suffrage means voting. Law is juris. So suffrage is just a funny word for voting, right? So, so the American Women's Suffrage Association supported the 15th Amendment, right? Okay, that might be a good place to stop because I'm about to jump in right before the 19th. So
wonderful, wonderful. So I have several questions for you. First of all, someone was asking to reconfirm the Black poet that was published. Was that Phyllis Wheatley?
Yes, Phyllis Wheatley, Phyllis with a Y.
Okay. And then so another question was, we're talking about men of all colors starting to vote. And then we were talking about women not yet having the right to vote. Yeah. The question was, what about immigrants? Did you have to be a United States citizen to vote at that time?
Yes. But the restrictions on immigration in this country were really zero until 1924. Yeah, 1924, the National Origins Act. So prior to 1924, we pretty much let anyone in the country because we wanted workers. Only less than 1% of the people who came here were kicked out. We wanted workers. And it just took you didn't have to get tests. It was just a timeline. It was 2 years. Once you were here for 2 years, you automatically became a citizen.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
the
next question was, when were women allowed to start to hold office?
Yeah, once you can vote, that like what we just said about Black men, once you can vote, you can run for office. So when there were women in the first state to allow women to vote was Wyoming. And I will believe, I should double check this, but Wyoming will have a congresswoman by the 1880s.
That's amazing. And then the other question I was going to ask you, there's a lot of questions, so I'm trying to cull through them here, but I think this is a good one. What was the age of voting then versus what it was now, what it is now?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it varies from state to state, because we have, in our country, we can pass laws about voting at the federal level, right, or at the state level. Some states had it at 20, 21. Oftentimes, and again, this you can see this, this feeds into the perception that women aren't that smart. If women were allowed to vote in some states, they had to be older than men did. And some states said, well, yeah, we'll let women vote, but only about things like school boards, because that's the stuff women care about, their education of their children. So it varied. But now, and it was during the Vietnam War, so I should know the exact date. I want to say 71, so about 40 years ago. There's a constitutional amendment that now says you are 18 and you can vote. And I know there are some states, and my friends out there in high school, you guys should pay attention to this. There are some states that will allow people who I think can register to vote when you're like 17 and a half, right? So, but now the law is 18, but it varies over time in place.
I think that's it. You can keep going.
All right, onward and upward. Keep those questions coming in. Okay, well, as I said, there was the anti-15th people, the NWSA, and the pro-15th people, the AWSA, right? Here's the thing. Most people in 1870 still, and I'm still talking about most women and girls, thought voting for women was crazy because, again, those unconditional myths, lies, and biases that we've all been soaking in. Politics are for men. Men are smart. They're natural leaders. Women will screw it up, right? So there was such a small group of women and men who actually thought women should vote in 1870. The fact that they split in two over the 15th Amendment really weakened the movement, right? But these two groups are going to reform in 1890. And by 1890, again, take a US history class, we have now entered into this period called the Progressive Era. You may have heard of Progressive Era or Progressivism. And basically, this is the idea that we're going to see all these groups formed saying, hey, government, right? Federal government, state government, local government, whoever. Hey, government, do more to help regular people. Right. So we're going to see all these groups formed, right? There are going to be groups about civil rights groups to help African Americans. There are going to be groups trying to protect or have the government pass laws about housing regulations, because this period where all these immigrants are pouring into the country and they're living in these overcrowded housings without bathrooms or heat, right? The conditions are horrible. We want laws about government passed laws saying kids have to be in school, not in factories, because child labor was completely legal at this time. Laws about worker safety and food safety, right? That if you're going to sell me a food in a grocery store, it better be safe, right? There are all these things that we're saying, hey, government, you do something. And so in many cases, who were not necessarily the leaders, but who were the foot soldiers in many of these movements, just like in the anti-slavery movement, were women, right? Primarily because women now were being told, you're nice. The one thing you're good at is being nice, right? So that I should care about other people, but especially middle-class women. So let me kind of take a little second here to explain this, right? And I'm using a purely economic definition here, guys, right? I know people will say, well, that doesn't sound right, but I'm just using purely economics here, right? The middle class isn't necessarily, look at all the people in a particular society and just go in the middle of not the really poor people, not the really rich people, right? That's not the economic definition of the middle class. The economic definition of the middle class is this, right? If you can make, if you live by yourself or your family can make enough money every month, and I know in the age of pandemics, right, this is a really stressful situation for a lot of people, but if you can make enough money every month and feed yourself and pay your rent or mortgage, right, your basic needs, and you don't go into debt, welcome to the middle class, right? So in reality, I think using purely economics, I think maybe about 30% of us are in the middle class in the United States. Most of us aren't, right? So the middle class, right, that definition of the middle class is a really new phenomena in the United States in the 1890s, right? Just started before the Civil War. So it's only about 30, 40 years old. And we see the leaders of this new middle class are people like lawyers, doctors, accountants, bankers, people we might call professionals or white collar people, right? I was able to go to college and I got these skills so I can get jobs that pay me a lot of money. And I make so much money, and this is a brand new thing on the history of the planet. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true, that I make so much money that I can support everyone else in my family. Right? Because it's not true, right? For most of human history, if you want to eat, man, woman, or child, you have to work, right? For most of human history, we were either hunters and gatherers or we were farmers, Everybody has to work. Once we start with industrialization in this country, 1830s, 1840s, this new middle class starts to emerge. And even though they're a tiny group, they're rich, so they're loud, and they get a lot of attention, right? So we see these now, this burgeoning middle class with my husband the lawyer, my husband the doctor, right? Middle class women, we don't have to work, right? That's a brand new phenomena, right? For most of human history, moms have worked, they've had to, right? So unlike my working class comrades, right? My working class, and if I'm a working class family, someone who doesn't go to college, right? In many cases, moms, dads, and kids, they're all having to work in the factory. For my farming colleagues, right? Moms, dads, and kids have to work in the farm. But for middle class people, it again starts right before the Civil War, my husband goes to the bank and I don't have to go to the fields. I don't have to go to a factory. I don't have to go to the office. I have lots of time on my hands. So I get involved in a lot of progressive groups and I get pats on the back because the one way women can be told good job isn't for being smart, isn't for being funny, it's for being nice. And if I'm out there helping an after school program or opening up libraries, and all these things are great things, I'm not making fun of them, right? But those are a way that women can be told good work. I'm not starting a business, I'm not running for office, right? I'm helping other people. That's what women are good at, right? So we see this, we see women's involvement, white women and Black women's involvement in this progressive era really shoot through the roof, right? Well, when NASA is formed, right, the reunification of those two groups in 1890, right, in 1890, there are 4 states, all Western states, that have allowed women the right to vote, right, on local and federal level, I guess, but those 4, if I can remember, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and Utah. So 4 is better than nothing, going in the right direction. So NASA realizes that they need to really if you're going to change something so core to human beings, women shouldn't vote. That's normal. That's natural. If you're going to change something like that, you've really got to go out and sell your message. Right? And so what NASA needed to do was to challenge the arguments against suffrage, which I'm going to go over first, and then telling them why we should let women vote. Okay, well, there were many organizations filled with men and women, right, that just didn't think women should vote. They didn't need the vote, right? Why should we let women vote when they all have husbands or fathers? Remember Coverture. When husbands and fathers vote, of course they vote for their families. Women don't need the vote. Women will it's kind of giving husbands 2 votes, some people said, because women will do exactly what their husbands tell them to do, right? Another thing we said is that if we let women vote, this will be bad for the country. The same thing we said about Black men back in the 15th Amendment. It's going to be bad for the country because we all know women aren't that smart. And if we let the not smart people vote, we'll have dumb politicians who will make dumb laws. It'll be bad for the country if we let women vote. There were others who said, you know, voting for women, it'll be bad for them. First off, their brains can't handle it. There were people, no joke, who taught at Harvard University, you guys have heard of Harvard, who said, if we let women vote, we won't be able to keep up with building enough asylums in this country because women will go crazy because voting is so hard. They won't be able to do it. They'll have mental breakdowns, right? And it'll be bad for women because voting is so masculine. Women will become like men, right? They'll start talking in deep voices and they'll grow facial hair and their ovaries will dry up and they won't be able to have children. Our society will fall apart if we let women vote because then they'll all be men. right? And as this poster here shows, one of the huge kind of rallying cry against women voting is, oh my God, if you let women vote, they'll take us over and they'll make us cook dinner and they'll make us do the laundry and they'll make us change diapers, right? No, 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 no. If women vote, everything will change. It kind of fits with those fears that some men had before the 15th Amendment, that women voting seemed more scary, right? Well, I think all those reasons that I just gave you are clearly not based in facts, right? Clearly not based in facts. But here was one reason that was legitimate. I'm not saying it was morally right, but at least they were telling the truth. There were many people who said, oh my goodness, if you let the ladies vote, they will outlaw alcohol, right? Because I think I said this before the Civil War, that was one of the radical movements in upstate New York and other places, that they wanted to outlaw alcohol in this country because they said it was sinful for society and bad for people and families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like in the anti-slavery movement, many of the foot soldiers in the temperance movement, that's what the anti-alcohol movement was called, were women. And so people thought if women vote, alcohol's outlawed. And companies like Anheuser-Busch and Coors, right, two big brewing companies, gave gazillions of dollars to the anti-suffrage movement because they were really scared if women got the right to vote. We do see prohibition in this country within a year after women's suffrage, so you can make a deduction there. Okay, well, what about the arguments for suffrage? Well, unfortunately, just like the anti-folks, there's gonna be a lot of misinformation. Those myth, lies, and biases are gonna affect this group too, unfortunately. One of the most common things was, well, look, we all know this, women are just nicer people. If you want to make this country more moral and nice, because men don't care about that stuff, let me vote because I'm such a nice person. Well, we all know, right? Most people are nice, but everyone can be a nice person or a jerk, right? My ability to be a nice person isn't tied to my gender, right? But that's what we said. Let me vote because I'm so nice, right? Another thing, now remember, we talked about the end of Reconstruction and how white Southerners in particular, but all white Americans were okay with segregation being reinstated in the South, right? That was a part of our fabric. And so there were many people who said, look, you want to keep this a white man's country? Let white women vote. So there was definitely some xenophobia and racism in the movement as well. If I was in the Northeast, where all those European immigrants were coming in, many of whom were Catholic and Jewish, right? We said, you want to keep this a Protestant white country? Let the Protestant white women vote. If I was in the South, right, I would have said, you know, again, we know we have the grandfather clause, the poll tax, literacy test, but there were still some Black men able to navigate that. You want to keep this a white man's country? Let white women vote. We will support segregation. So there was definitely some racism in there. Right? Yet, like the arguments against, there were definitely some honest arguments. And probably the biggest one is I put no taxation without representation, right? This country was founded on the idea of voting. We should let women vote because it's the American thing to do. We are adults. Women have to follow the laws, so let women help make the laws. It's what makes sense, right? And I don't know, can you guys see this picture at the bottom of these African-American women there, right? This is, I don't know if it's because of this, maybe I have to, can you guys see it now? You might have to move your little box of pictures. But this is a group called the Alpha Suffrage Club, and it was founded in Chicago, Illinois. I want to say 1912, 1910, right around there, maybe 1912, but just before that big suffrage parade that I showed you at the start of my presentation. And this was a very famous suffrage group of African American women led by a very famous woman at the time called Ida B. Wells. She was a college-educated, middle-class African American woman. She ran a newspaper. She was one of the strongest advocates, not only for suffrage, but even more so for trying to end lynching in the United States. There were many Black women involved in the suffrage movement, not always treated well, as you will see, but there were many African American women who were involved in suffrage organizations, who were college students and sororities for Black women. There were another part of that progressive era that I talked about, where all these women's clubs were formed, middle-class women, white middle-class women, Black middle-class women. And for Black women who were involved in all these groups, one of their famous lines was that we are committed to raising our race. Once the federal government let us down, if I was a Black woman, once the federal government, my dog just came in, so I need to say hello to her. Good girl, Zia. Once the federal government let us down, when those troops were gone, we as Black people had to do this ourselves, right? And if we are gonna raise our race, right, we saw not only voting as key, because again, when you're allowed to vote, you can vote for politicians who look out for you. But one thing that African American men, they worked so hard for was establishing schools, private schools run by African American women, because after Reconstruction and segregation gets put in place, there were public schools for Black kids, absolutely, but they weren't as good as the public schools for white kids. And middle-class African Americans, and I think this is true for all middle-class people, quite frankly, but middle-class African Americans knew what a solid education can do to change people's lives, right? So for women like Ida B. Wells, right, she became a strong advocate for suffrage, not only for the reasons that I just said, well, not to keep this a white man's country, but the idea that it's an issue of fairness, right? But because she saw this as a tool of improving the state of African Americans, right? Okay. Well, as I said, there was definitely this attitude in this country by men, most men and most women, of course not everyone, but for most men and women, that women were really nice and kind and sweet, and women don't raise their voices, and I'm just, you know, I'll do whatever you want to do. I don't complain. I'll do whatever, you know, we're the nice ones, right? And so when NASA, their tactics were, like I said, they had 4 states by 1890 that allowed women to vote. They didn't think there was enough support in the country to do something like the 15th Amendment yet, right? They couldn't do all that, but they wanted to focus on a state-by-state strategy. So they went out to state capitals, Sacramento, Boston, Albany, et cetera, right? I should know more state capitals, but those are the 3 that come to mind. Montpelier in Vermont, I know that one. So they went to state capitals and they lobbied. Hey, state governments, let women vote at your state level. But there were real strong rules, right? Because remember what the anti-people said, if women vote, they'll become mean and loud and men and da-da-da, right? So they had really particular rules about what happened when women went out to lobby the government. So you couldn't raise your voice, you didn't interrupt. If a politician says, no, women shouldn't vote, they all have husbands, you didn't yell and call them a Neanderthal. You said, okay, well, thank you so much for meeting with me. Hopefully I can talk to you later, right? So that was their strategy. Be nice, smile, don't be rude. Well, this is really different from what's happening in England, in Great Britain. Because England was an industrialized country too, so they also have this middle class. So this group of women who don't have to go to work, right? Because they have wealthy husbands or fathers. And same thing, right? These middle class women in England are doing all these things for other people, and they say, gosh, you know, how many more kids could we help? How much more progressive laws could we pass if we let women vote? And in the leaders of the suffrage movement in England, they were called the suffragettes in England, as opposed to the suffragists here in the United States, were a mom and two daughters, the Pankhursts, right? Emmeline Pankhurst was the mom. And man, they were so opposite the American women. They were way more in your face, because their attitude was, if you're going to change something at your core, like women shouldn't vote, you've got to jump up and down and scream and get people's attention, right? So these women got arrested, right? That would never happen in the United States this time, because that was considered too radical, too masculine. They did parades, they got arrested, they would follow politicians home from Parliament, which is the national government, right, in London, and sing suffrage songs and yell at politicians and, you know, stay under their bedroom window at night and throw rocks at it and yell at them. So we're not gonna let you sleep if you don't let us vote. Like, they were really, really in your face. I think one of my favorite stories about the folks in England was they went into Parliament, which is an open building, just like our US Congress. And they kind of snuck in the building overnight, and over the night they climbed up the roof of the House of Commons, which is the equivalent to our Congress, right? And the next morning, the Speaker of the House is gaveling in the session, and then these women up in the rafters start flinging out their pro-suffrage flags, and they start singing suffrage songs, right? So they were like, we want to do crazy antics, because when you see rich women do crazy things, that gets in the newspaper, and it will force people to think about stuff, because you can't change anything if you don't make people think about stuff, right? It was crucial. I think I have this set up. I tested it before. I have a little clip that I'm about to show you. I should know the exact date. I think it's 1910, 1912, right around there. It's Derby Day in England. I know it's spelled Derby, but in England they call it Derby. And if you've been to England, and you all should go to England, it's an awesome place. They're really into horses, gambling and horses, right? And so Derby Day is kind of like our Super Bowl Sunday in this country, big parties, gambling, right? All that sort of stuff, people betting on games. And it's Derby Day, and this is in the 1910s. So there's film, but no TV, but everyone's listening to this race, the horse race on the radio, because we've all bet on it, right? And it's kind of like it's a cultural thing, right? Everyone celebrates on Derby Day. So I'm gonna play the tape, and then I'll talk about it. And I apologize, I couldn't figure out a way to get this without a little ad at the beginning. So you're gonna have some consumerism forced upon you. Oh, I should stop. Can you guys see? I think I remember now. I think I screwed this up. Can you guys see the YouTube video that I put up there?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Now I remember it. All right, my fault, guys.
No.
Okay, sorry about that. So I'll tell you it. Right.
No.
You can Google this if you want. What happened was at this Derby Day is a young woman with a Votes for Women sash, right? As the horses were coming around the final turn, about to cross the finish line, this young woman jumps in front of the horses, and the horses trample her. She's horribly injured. She goes into a coma, and she dies maybe 4 or 5 days later. And everybody's listening to this. This is on live radio, right? And the initial knee-jerk reaction, see, women are crazy. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, who dies so other people can vote? I mean, she's not going to be able to vote. What a crazy thing. This was the kind of uproar across England, probably around the world too. And then people, when you say that out loud, it kind of sinks into you, right? Sinks into your head. You're making fun of someone who's willing to die so that other people can vote. That's what we usually thank soldiers for. Right? So events like this started to show people that women get it. Women know, right, how important voting is, that they're willing to sacrifice, right? So really different parallel movements in England and the United States, but really different, right? Okay, well, I can't, let me see. Okay. Oh, here I go. Okay. Well, what's going to bring this more radical approach to the United States is this woman, a woman by the name of Alice Paul, right? Middle class, white woman, was in college. She's the first woman in the United States to get a PhD in political science. She went to London and worked with the Pankhurst, and she definitely saw from a political perspective how effective this kind of guerrilla street activity, this kind of in your face, loud and bold actions did. And when she came back to the United States, she started to work for NASA. She became a lobbyist. She was told, be nice. And she was like, that's not how things change. You have to force people to think about this stuff. And man, did she force people to think about it in 1913. Now, she's the organizer of this parade. Remember the program at the start of the program. In 1913, it was Inauguration Day. And, or it was inauguration, it's the day before Inauguration Day, but Woodrow Wilson, you guys have probably heard of Woodrow Wilson. He was just elected president in November of 1912, right? And before he was president, he was the governor of New Jersey. And so he was taking the train from New Jersey down to Washington, D.C. And like all presidents, would it be all? It was definitely true for Lincoln. I would say most presidents before him and all after him. When you're the new incoming president, right, it's kind of the tradition that there are people there welcoming you now at the airport or the train station, or however you come into Washington, D.C. And Alice Paul said, I don't want people welcoming Woodrow Wilson because he's the leader of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party in 1913 is absolutely opposed to women voting. The Republican Party had no comment, no opinion. It's not an important enough an issue to comment on, but the Democrats said absolutely no way, right? So Alice Paul says he should pay. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna organize this big parade of 10,000 plus people at the exact same time that he's gonna step off that train. Because Alice Paul knew that she could draw the crowds. And that's what happens. We have these, in fact, I should have put a picture up here. We have these really sad pictures of President-elect Wilson and his wife stepping off the train at this big fancy train station, Union Station in DC, and there's nobody there. And he's angry. He's really angry. If he wasn't anti-women voting before this, man, was he mad at Alice Paul, because she kind of outstunted him, right? And then we have this huge parade, like I said, about 10,000 people. And there were a lot of people there watching, not necessarily because Washington, D.C. was such a progressive town that supported women voting. As late as 1913, by 1913 now, there's probably about 15 states, right? That state strategy was working, about 15 states that let women vote, like one of them, California. But still, most people thought women who wanted the vote were these scary, crazy aliens who were going to grow mustaches and, you know, make men cook dinner, right? So there were a lot of people in Washington who just wanted to take a look at these crazy women, right? And unfortunately, because of that, when these women marched from the US Congress down to the White House, about 2 miles down the road, a lot of people who were watching the parade started throwing rocks and bottles at these women. They started to get beaten up. There was a lot of violence in this parade. As I showed you 2 or 3 slides ago, Ida B. Wells and her Alpha Suffrage group did indeed march in this parade, as did a lot of Black club women, as did a lot of Black women in sororities. I don't know if any of you read Kamala Harris's piece, I think it was in the New York Times today. She talked about these women who were Black suffragists, right? And she said, we all have to vote because we got to remember these women who did all this work so that we could vote. But the sad thing was, and Ida B. Wells said, I'm not doing this, but the sad thing was Alice Paul, right? Because again, she was kind of, what's that word? Kind of threading the needle, right? Remember the idea, we want a white man's country, let us vote. She wanted the Black women there because the more people in the parade showed more power. But she did say, Black women, you have to march in the back of the parade. And there were women like Ida B. Wells said, no, that's not going to happen. And they made their way to the front of the parade. But that was definitely part of the suffrage movement, definitely reflected the attitudes of the country at the time. Well, NASA did not like Alice Paul's tactics. Remember, they're the ones, be polite, be nice, right? So when she kind of embarrassed the incoming president, she gets kicked out of NASA and forms her own suffrage group, the National Women's Party. So two groups now, one more liberal, slow, we want change, but we're going to be polite. One way more radical and in your face. NASA is a big group by this time, well over 1 million people, women and men. The National Women's Party, much smaller, but way more in your face tactics, right? Okay, should I stop there for some questions? I'm almost at the end, I believe.
The one thing that I did see, a lot of the questions you answered.
Okay.
One question was about the silent sentinels and how did they help the movement?
You know, I'm assuming, and I don't know that name. I'm assuming that they might be an African-American suffrage group, and so they, if they are, and if they're not, person, please put it in the chat, and you can tell me who they are. If they are, I would say they were a lot like the Alpha suffrage group, who again supported suffrage, called the suffrage movement out on their unfairness and racism, but saw that the vote for Black women could help support the African-American community. Again, their phrase, raise their race. But I don't know that. I think that's a great question. You stumped me.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't familiar with it either. That's why I threw it out there. The other one that I saw was how many women were arrested?
Yeah, we're about to get to, I just got a note. Okay, thank you, Jack. My son just came in. How many women were arrested? Well, we're just about to talk about that. There's these World War I protests, we're gonna see hundreds of women arrested as we see.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's coming. And
The silent sentinels are the ones in your picture, I believe. It's the ones that were in front of the White House. Their name. They were called the silent sentinels in front of the White House.
Oh, you mean these pictures here? Because this is in front of the White House.
Yes. The
Oh,
one on the
I never, I know who these women are. I never heard of that before, but thank you it's always good for me to learn new things. Great. So I'm going to talk about them.
we're all caught up.
Oh, so that's it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now it's 1917, right? World War I started in 1914, right? It was a completely European and their colonies war, that ugly, brutal, horrible war. Take a class on that, right? Woodrow Wilson, right? I didn't mention this, he's a historian before he became a governor, right? The only historian we've ever had in the White House yet. And he wants to get involved in World War I. And he wants to get involved with World War I on the side of the British, because as a historian, he thinks the United States and Great Britain have a special historical connection. But he knows that if he gets us into the war, there was polling back then, most Americans, World War I was an ugly, nasty, horrible war. Most Americans don't want to send their sons and husbands to this horrible war where the death rates were so high, especially since England was on one side of World War I and they're at war with Germany in World War I. And most Americans are German, right? Most Americans had cousins, parents, aunts and uncles, or they don't want to go to war against their cousins. So Wilson knew this, right? Remember I said Wilson was elected in 1912. So he ran again in 1916 and he wins. And what happens right after he wins? He gets us involved in World War I. Because he says, well, they can't do anything to me now. I just got in my second term, right? I'm free. So there were huge protests across the United States. German Americans protested, Irish Americans protested, because the Irish were okay with getting involved in World War I, but they wanted to get into the war against the British, right, because of Irish colonization. And there were just people who didn't want to send their family members off to what does Europeans killing each other have to do with me, a farmer in Iowa? Like, people just didn't see a connection. And so Wilson had to kind of, as all presidents do during, not just in our country, but all democratically elected leaders have to do, when you send people's kids to war, you have to tell them why it's a good idea, right? You have to sell it. And so what Wilson does is he says, well, we have to support this war because this is a war for liberty and equality and democracy. This happens, I'm not just picking on President Wilson, everybody does this when there's a war, right? You use these kind of vague, big terms, because how could anyone be against liberty if this war is about liberty, right? Well, Alice Paul, remember, PhD in political science, she's a smart one. She said, huh, that's interesting. President Wilson is saying this is a war about liberty and democracy, but he's against women voting? Well, that's a big fat contradiction. So what we then see, right, is Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, right, start to organize these round-the-clock, 24 hours a day, except on Sunday, because she's a passionate Quaker, right, in front of the White House, right. If you saw, remember, was it like 2 months ago when there were protesters outside of the White House and they were cleared, and then President Trump walked across the street? Remember that? Stood in front of a church. That's exactly where they were there. That's the backside of the White House on Lafayette Square, right? This is where they were. And there were about 20 of them, and it was a silent protest because, again, even though Alice Paul learned from the in-your-face people in Britain, this was a war and people were dying. So she wanted a certain degree of dignity, right? So they were silent. You guys were silent sentinels. I'm going to have to look that up, right? But they were definitely silent. But they would hold up signs like this: Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Right? If you're a fan of liberty in Europe, why shouldn't you be a fan of liberty in the United States? Pointing out the president's hypocrisy, right? Well, like I said, this was a drop in the bucket compared to protests across the country. This was a very unpopular war in the United States, right? But this was right outside the president's bedroom window, right? He got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. He looked out the window. He saw these women. They annoyed him. So what he says, remember, he's the president, you get some power. He tells the police, the park police, right, who cleared out those protesters, right, a couple weeks ago, a month ago now in DC, he told those park police to arrest those women. They bug me. And so the park police arrested these women, and they said they were blocking the sidewalk. You can clearly see in these pictures they weren't. These women knew the law, right? And they said, we weren't blocking the sidewalk, right? We're not going to sign your statement when they got to jail, when they got to the police station, saying, that's a lie. We weren't blocking the sidewalk. You arrested us because you didn't like our signs. And that's against the law in the United States, because the First Amendment of the Constitution says, I have the right to complain about my government, and I'm complaining about my government, and that's why you arrested me, right? So, like I said, there were only about 15 or 20 women out there at a time. So that first group of 15 or 20 women got arrested, and then more of them came, and then more of them came, and then more, and ultimately 144 women are jailed, right, during these World War I protests. It wasn't wildly reported in the newspaper because so much was going on in the country. But as they were jailed for about 2 or 3 months, I think probably even closer to 4 months, right? But definitely a few months here. And it became a real problem for President Wilson because he was terrified if this news gets out. Because remember the ideology about women at this time, they're so nice and they're so kind and men should take care of them. What kind of man would he be seen as if he was so annoyed by women standing in front of his house that he had them arrested, right? That wouldn't make him seem like a very good man. So he hoped and hoped that these women would just sign the document saying they were blocking the sidewalk because then he'd have cover. Well, they wouldn't. So he started to make the conditions in the jail pretty ugly, right? Yeah, you got fed, but there were maggots in your food, right? We took away mattresses and blankets. So women, and some of these women were in their 60s and 70s, were sleeping on concrete floors. Some women were thrown into solitary confinement, right? Meaning, think of a closet with no window, and that's where you were for 23 hours a day. I mean, this was pretty brutal stuff. When Alice Paul got arrested, because she didn't get arrested right away, she got arrested probably a week or so in, and she saw that they were at a stalemate. So she went on a hunger strike, and about 12, maybe 15 or other women joined her. And this was like a chess match between President Wilson and her. Is he really going to let me die in jail? Because when you die in jail, there's an investigation, and then this whole story will come out. And so President Wilson orders these women who are on hunger strikes. It's pretty brutal. He orders them force-fed, which is pretty horrible. A rubber hose is either sent down your nose or down your throat, and then food is forced down. I mean, it's, and you're handcuffed while this, it's a pretty brutal situation. What eventually breaks this story is a woman reporter heard about the things going on in the jail. And so she whatever, shoplifted or something, got sent to jail, and she saw this happening. And then she agreed, she went, okay, let me out. I'm sorry I shoplifted, I'll pay my fine, but let me out of jail. And then she wrote the story. And this became headline news across the country. What a brute the president is, force-feeding women, arresting women. They've been in jail for months. And so this was, and already he's the president of a very unpopular war. So this is another difficult thing for him to have to manage. So remember I said Alice Paul got kicked out of NASA because she embarrassed the president to be at that parade. NASA is, like I said, was a very powerful group by this time. And even though Wilson was against women's suffrage, when the president of NASA, this woman by the name of Carrie Chapman Catt, called the White House and said, I need to see the White House, need to see the president, she went and met with the president. And she said to President Wilson, you are having a bad day in the newspapers, sir. This is not looking good for you. But I can tell you how you can get these horrible headlines off the newspapers. Well, how can I do that, Mrs. Catt? Come out in favor of women's suffrage. No one will say that you're mean to women if you come out in support of women's suffrage. And I will scratch your back if you scratch mine. If you support women voting, I will help you sell your war. Right? NASA was a group of over 1 million people, and Carrie Chapman Catt was a tenacious leader. She was called the general. She could get her suffrage workers to say, this is a good war. This is why you should support it, right? She was willing to help him. And so President Wilson took the deal. And he said, the next day, I don't know what I was thinking, but I love the idea of women voting. I'm all for it. And I'm not talking about any particular president, right? But the office of the presidency is a pretty conservative office. And again, I'm using a purely political term here. If a liberal is someone who wants social change, but I'm okay with it slow, a conservative is someone who wants to resist change. I want to keep things the way they are, right? So again, I'm not talking about President Wilson as a person, but the office of the presidency throughout history is a pretty conservative office. So the fact that the president says, I'm okay with women voting, it no longer was, will the 19th Amendment ever happen? But when it will happen, right? So what we see now after, and those arrests happened in 1917, right? For the next 2 years, just like it was really quick with the 15th Amendment because it was Reconstruction, and again, take a history class, there were so many southern states that weren't allowed to vote on the Constitution, right? But for the next year and a half, or maybe even closer to 2 years, we start targeting states. Because in order to add something to the Constitution, I might get these numbers wrong, I think it's 75% of people in Congress, no, I think it's 2/3 in Congress have to think it's a good idea, but then 75% of the state governments have to. It's really hard. there are so many people who say too hard to change our Constitution, right? So the last state, right, they only needed one more state, and it's, again, 100 years ago this week. And the state that they thought was going to be the best bet was the state of Tennessee. Now, in general, right, the North, the West especially, but also the North, was more open to the idea of women voting than the South. The South was just more conservative, right? So Tennessee was a slave state. It was one of those states that said, I hate you, United States. We want to create our own country. But it wasn't the Deep South. So they thought they had a better chance in Tennessee than in Louisiana, right? So it was the summer of Tennessee, in the summer of 1920 in Memphis, or sorry, in Nashville, the state capital of Tennessee. And oh, here's a picture of Carrie Chapman Catt, that woman at the bottom. She was the president of NASA. Carrie Chapman Catt went to Tennessee. She had her army with her to lobby politicians. So it was the pro-suffrage group and also the anti-suffrage group. Remember the alcohol industry and lobbying all summer. And there were polls in 1920, just like there are today. And whenever there were polls, the number, it was always like 50-50, so close. No one knew. It was, you know, and everybody knew that. So just as we got closer to the date of the vote, right, in the end of August, the two sides were regularly meeting. Right, these, you know, they knew each other. They were meeting in this one hotel in Nashville, and they would regularly say, "You don't know if you're going to win. I don't know if we're going to win. Maybe we can make a deal." Right, and the deal that the anti-people had, right, that people against women's suffrage was this: okay, we might support this, but you've got to say this is about white women, right? Again, remember that after Reconstruction, we wanted to reinstate, give us something to say this is just about white women, because a lot of white Southerners were nervous that somehow this would mean more Black people voting again. And so Carrie Chapman Catt and her advisors thought about it and considered it. And there, I know I can't open this link either. Now I remember from last time, but this was a document that was widely published in Tennessee and other states that were considering supporting the 19th Amendment, the truth about the Negro problem. Again, linking back to some of those ideas that I talked about, the Civil War. If we let Black people vote, it'll be bad for the country. Remember the myths, lies, and biases. They're not as smart as I am. They're not as trustworthy as I am, right? They're gonna, in fact, because they're not a surprise, there's a lot of stories in the newspapers today or on the radio, like Kamala Harris's piece. I heard a story today that there was I think he was a senator, a US senator from South Carolina, that said, if we let Black women vote, it will ruin white civilization. I mean, the hyperbole, right, was just insane. Well, Carrie Chapman Catt, like I said, and her advisors, that was one of my dogs, considered, right, the deal, because she was like, well, at least something is better than nothing, right? But they ended up rejecting the deal. And they rejected the deal because they remembered the 15th Amendment. And they remembered that, those are my dogs. Hi, Jack. Those are my dogs. And they remembered that with the 15th Amendment, they didn't like it, right? That Frederick Douglass said, this is the Black man's hour, right? Yes, women of course should vote, but right now, Black men need the vote more than you, right? And so Carrie Chapman said, no deal, because we didn't like it when we were excluded, right, back in 1870. We don't want to exclude Black women now. So they rejected the deal, and I think I'm just going to close this door. They rejected the deal. They rejected the deal, and then the vote happens, right? Again, 100 years ago this week. And like I said, there was polling going on, and, you know, there was the group of politicians that were absolutely for suffrage. There were a group of politicians that were against suffrage. And then there was that kind of growing smaller group in the middle who they thought could be lobbying. Well, if you ever watch C-SPAN or something, when there's a vote, it's always alphabetical. And one of the politicians, one of the state representatives in Nashville, was a young man. I don't even think he was 22. It's a young man named Harry T. Byrne, right? And Harry Byrne, all summer long, when he was asked, he always said, I'm anti it. They'll take away alcohol. Women have husbands. They don't need the vote, blah, blah, blah. Always. He wasn't on the fence. Anti. And when they called his name, he said I, which means yes. He was voting for the 19th. And people, shocked, right? What are you? And at the end of the day, the 19th Amendment passed in Tennessee by one vote. You can't make this stuff up. This is why studying history is so interesting, right? And when he was interviewed after, right, Harry Byrne said, well, I wasn't here much the last week because I was back home visiting my mom, who's really sick. And she told me that I should go back to Nashville. And if Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt needs my vote, you vote for her, right? So it was one of the last wishes of his dying mother. And he did what his mother told him to do and voted for the 19th Amendment, right? So the 19th Amendment is added, right, in August of 1920. Again, it says you can't prevent people from voting on the basis of sex. But unfortunately, while there were many Black women in Nashville, like this woman here, Frankie Pierce, right, who were advocating for the 19th Amendment, just like Ida B. Wells, again, the raise our race focus, the reality was that just like their Black male counterparts, Black women also got caught by those state laws, the poll tax, the literacy test, and the grandfather clause, right? So we won't see, there will always be some Black women who can vote, but we won't see Black women voting in huge numbers until the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which is 55 years ago, not that long, right? That will make the poll tax, the literacy test, and grandfather clause all illegal in the United States. But with the 19th Amendment in 1920, white women are now allowed to vote across the United States. I kept you all here for a long time. I'm sorry about that. I thought it would be shorter than that, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
So hi,
in there, that's amazing.
I wanted to ask you, I know we're gonna share with all the girls the recording. Several of the girls are very impressed with the slides and want to know if there's any way they could get a copy of the slides. I don't know if that's a possibility.
Yeah, if you email me,
Yes.
I can, I'm not as, I can, yeah, I can get them, I'm happy to send the slides if I think I can figure that out.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. You can send them to me and I'll take it, or getting them to the girls.
Yeah.
And you know what, this was absolutely incredible, so comprehensive. You went way farther into everything and it was amazing. It was so informative. So thank you again. We appreciate that you spent the afternoon with us and shared not only your time, but your extensive knowledge. I think that we're all better people for hearing what you had to share with us for the last hour and a half. So we appreciate you. Thank you. I would like to invite all of the girls to unmute yourselves and give Miss Ann a big thank you and Girl Scout goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to say,
Thanks.
for those of you who are old, you're so welcome. You've got to vote. It's so important to vote. Make sure you vote. And if you're under 18, bug everyone you know to vote. Make sure everybody you know votes.
Charlotte.
Thank you.
Hi, Charlotte.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
I have one question though.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question.
So my aunt is white and my uncle is black. Was dating a black woman or a black man like illegal, or was it wrong back then?
I didn't hear all of the question, but were you saying about white people and black people getting married? Is that
Yes.
the question? Yeah. Okay. So it's different based on state laws, right? So there was a really famous Supreme Court case, the Love case in Virginia, and I should know the date. I think it was 1960 something, maybe even as late as the 70s. There were certain states like Virginia that said it was illegal. In the South, after Reconstruction, that was very illegal. Right, so it varied on a state-by-state basis, but the Supreme Court decision, you can Google this, it's called the Love, I know it's kind of funny that the last name is Love, right, but it's the Love case, and it was the Supreme Court struck down, they're called miscegenation laws. I know it's a weird legal name, but it became legal in every state for African-American and European-American, people of mixed races to marry after the Love case. Hey, Jim, are you here? When was that Love case about miscegenation laws?
Loving?
Yeah, Loving.
Versus,
It's Loving.
about miscegenation, so it was
Yeah,
about.
what year was that?
60s.
Yeah, 60s. My husband
And
helped
the
me.
reason I ask is since we're talking about like the not equal like topic is because my aunt is white and the black, so I was just wondering.
That is such a common American story. It really is. That's so American. Yeah. You guys have any other questions?
Oh, we have another question. Alice, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Never answered. Were women allowed to go to the library or receive a formal education?
I couldn't get you out. Alice, could you maybe come a little closer to your microphone? I couldn't get it, or you could put it in the chat.
I did put it in the chat. It was never answered. Were women allowed to go to the library or receive a formal education?
Oh yeah, no, so again, it all depended on the state, right? So in northern states, there were public schools from really early on. In fact, a lot of northern states during the colonial period had schools for white boys and girls. Massachusetts was the first one. Massachusetts had public schools for black boys and girls, I think in the 1850s. But yeah, no, libraries were not segregated by gender, but they were by race and segregation. There were times that your local library allowed white kids or white people to go in and black people to go in. But in general, most northern states had a pretty strong public school system for girls from very early on. Not so much in the South, but definitely in the North.
I think we have one more question. We'll take one more question. Diana is raising her hand. So Diana, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Well, I was wondering, was this all close in like the timeline to the Boston Tea Party?
So the Boston Tea Party was in 1770. So that was right before my first slide when the Declaration of Independence was written, and the Boston Tea Party was all about voting. They threw that tea in the water because that tea was being taxed and they didn't have representation. So it was before this, the 19th Amendment, but it's definitely related.
All right, so ladies, we're gonna let everybody go enjoy the rest of their evening, particularly Miss Ann. Ann, thank you so much for your time and
Go vote, go vote, go vote.
Thank you.
bye girls.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.